The next frontier is probably going to be on the robotics side. We've seen incredible developments in AI.
Hey guys, you are listening to the Modern Acre podcast. Coming up, we're talking to our favorite ag economist, Matt Woolf, all about the latest that's happening in the ag economy and specifically in California. Tim, I think it's time to get a farm update. How are things going? We are in the thick of it at Nest Farms right now.
Yes, it's the dog days of summer, as they say, but we've been just super busy the past couple weeks with harvest kicking into gear. Last week, we're harvesting 2 different types of peppers, watermelons, herbs. So a lot of different things going on with coordinating harvest crews and weeding crews and tractor schedules, irrigation. So it's the busiest time of the year on the farm, but it's been really good. It's been a pretty favorable season weather-wise, where it's been pretty mild, like through the start of summer, which has been definitely helpful for crops where you don't have a lot of heat stress and those kind of pressure-related issues with climate. So that's been super good. I was talking to a grower last week and he said, yeah, like this year is like farming with training wheels on. There's like not having the variable of like 110-degree days makes things quite a bit easier, but overall it's going pretty good. Like I think we're in a tough farm economy. We get into that in our conversation with Matt. So like we're just kind of hunkered down this year trying to execute as best we can, but seeing kind of movement on fresh market crops being a little bit sluggish this summer, like especially on watermelons. Pricing on kind of some of our contract stuff has gone down. So really trying to like make the best of it and manage the expense side to get through this year.
It's crazy how like so many variables have to go right for it to be like a killer year as a farmer. But if one of the many variables goes wrong, you're like struggling to break even, right? Like this is the life of farming. Is every once in a while the stars aligned, you have a good year, you have a good, you have good pricing, you have good weather, everything is going your way. But yeah, even in a year, Tim, where we're seeing great weather, good growing conditions, the market the market is challenged. So it's just, I think, a real tough dynamic in agriculture and in farming right now. So let's jump into it, Tim, because I think talking to Matt, he really, has a good pulse on what's happening and the impact of the market is having on farming. So I think anyone in agriculture, whether you're a farmer or not, can learn a lot from Matt in this conversation. So we'll jump in with what's top of mind for Matt, but first a word from our sponsor.
The Modern Acre podcast is presented by American Ag Credit. American Ag Credit is a proud member of the Farm Credit System, which was created more than 100 years ago with the sole purpose of serving the financial needs of farmers and ranchers. From small farms to the largest agribusiness enterprises, American Ag Credit understands agriculture and how to structure customized financial solutions. Just like many of the guests we have on the pod, American Ag Credit recognizes that the evolution of agriculture is inevitable and exciting. Their goal is to be at the forefront of this evolution, partnering with producers to grow their future in ways they haven't imagined yet. To learn more about American Ag Credit and to receive exclusive access to reports from Terrain, a research and insight service of American Ag Credit, visit agloan.com/terrain or hit the link in our show notes.
Hey, Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Welcome back. It was great chatting with you. I don't know what that was, a year or so ago, and just getting your insights into the ag market, specifically in California and around specialty. A lot's happened in a year. Like what have you been, in your role at Terrain, like what have you been focused on recently? What have you been digging into?
Yeah, one thing I've been digging into quite a lot is kind of examining where some of the row crops of vegetable markets are going relative to the nut markets. In general, what we've seen in post-COVID is relatively low nut pricing relative to vegetable pricing. And I think what we have been seeing in the last year or so is kind of a great normalization, where a lot of that vegetable pricing is returning to more normal levels. Nut pricing and particularly almonds, have made some real strides. All that said, recently we had a USDA estimate that put the almond crop at about 3 billion pounds, which really hurt the spot market. And so we've seen basically all that price progress in the last year be eliminated in just a couple of weeks. Yeah, I will say that I think at this time of year, there's a lot less liquidity in the market. And so there's a lot more volatility in pricing. So I think that's something to be aware of. But we're certainly going to be watching crop receipts closely as we go into 2025 harvest.
Matt, how accurate are like the USDA numbers? I know they do a lot of forecasting on a lot of different commodities. Like, where is that coming from? And obviously, like, it has a big impact if they're projecting kind of a really big or big low number on what the spot market does. Like, how accurate and where does that data come from?
Yeah, so what they do is they examine orchards themselves. They do a survey for the subjective estimate, and then the objective estimate, they are actually examining orchards themselves. There's a lot of concern right now because it's become a lot harder to do that, especially trying to zero in on what the bearing acreage number is. There's a lot of abandoned orchards out there, so it's very, very difficult to do that right now, just given where the economics have been and where grower practices have been. So it's become more challenging. I will say in the last few years, they've overestimated pretty consistently. I think because of that, we'll see as the crop receipts come in. One concern I have is that this year things look to be a little bit early. And so I think those crop receipts are going to be earlier and maybe bias a little bit on the higher side. And so it's something to be aware of. I think it's going to be pretty difficult to know where the market is as we get into the fall.
All right, I want to dig into you. You came prepared with some questions, and I want to dig in on some of these. So tell us about the big shrink. What's the big shrink, and how will it affect ag?
Yeah, so the Big Shrink is a report series from Terrain that's exploring the effects of population growth and population decline on agricultural markets. So if you think about the last 50 to 100 years or so in agriculture, population growth has been a huge tailwind. We've been able to build up our supply in a lot of industries while relying on the export markets that have really grown in terms of income as well as population. Domestic market as well is a good example. We've seen population growth, in the U.S. and income growth in the U.S. as well. And so we've been able to kind of rely on these growing markets while building up our productivity. And we've gotten this idea of feed the world, right? Which we hear at ag conferences. We hear that in the ag media as well. It's a really important guiding principle that it's largely been a success. We've seen land values appreciate. We've seen revenue per acre in general go up over time. And I think we're going to see a big change going forward in the next 50 to 100 years. So we've done some demographic forecasting at Terrain, trying to understand when that global population is going to peak. And we put the number around 2065, where the population will peak at about 9.4 billion, after which, we're going to see a sustained decline in the global population. We've already seen decline in China's population, Europe's population, South Korea, Japan, a lot of these pretty big markets. And so this report series, the Big Shrink, is referring to the shrinking global population or the soon to be shrinking population and trying to understand what that means for marketing organizations, processors who export overseas, and then all the way back to the farmer.
Matt, what's causing this? Like, I see it on like my social media feed about population decline. I feel like Elon's always beating the drum about this. Like, what are the drivers behind why the population is declining?
Yeah, there are a lot of theories out there from different fields like sociology, economics. I find two of the most convincing ones come from economics. One is that the opportunity cost of time goes up as a population gets richer. We tend to see lower fertility rates in populations that are more developed, so economies that are more developed. And so I think if you consider a family, two parents that are working, as their wages go up, they're going to be more incentivized to spend more time at the office to earn more. Time spent at the office is going to take them away from time that would have otherwise be spent raising children, chasing toddlers around. So that's number one. And then number two, which is kind of related, we just raise children very differently today than we did 50 years ago or 100 years ago in a big way. Now there's a lot more expectations about how much education to provide to a child, extracurriculars. These things are very, very expensive as well. They tend to outstrip CPI, all these very labor intensive activities. And so that's another factor that's at play. But I would also just say, those are very simplistic explanations. I also think there is an element of, culture and religion that is playing into this as well. As economists, we tend to be a little bit arrogant about our field, thinking that we can explain everything, but I will readily admit that there are other factors at play to be considered.
I feel so seen about having children.
I was going to say, we were just talking about
having
having
children and it
kids.
being expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep. I'm headed that way. So I'll have to get your advice.
Totally. So how can societies, countries reverse population decline? Like, is there a solution to this? I feel like we've heard Elon talk a lot about this. Like, I'm curious your thoughts.
In my opinion, this is the most interesting public policy debate right now,
Hmm.
is whether fertility rates can be reversed and whether that can in turn reduce population decline. A lot of different countries have tried different things. These are countries with different governments, different kind of places on the democratic to, less democratic scale. So China has tried different policies, Japan, the US, Australia. I could go on and on, Hungary. So there's a lot of stuff being tried, from tax credits to childcare to, education subsidies even, which, can kind of fit into that. Even just lump sum payments, sometimes called a baby bonus. And so there's a lot of stuff being thrown out there. The percentage of countries that are trying these sorts of policies is increasing and increasing over time. I think it's about 35% now of countries around the world are trying one thing or another. Basically, what the empirical literature has shown is that there's zero to little effect here of these policies. And when there is an effect, it's often temporary. There was a really interesting analysis of trying to understand what it would take from a budget point of view to elevate US fertility rates at a sustained level. And it was in the hundreds of billions, pushing a trillion. So these elasticities are such that it's very, very costly to actually have an impact. And so that's kind of where we are. There's not a huge effect that's to be had, at least at this point. And again, I've been digging into this myself in the empirical literature, but I asked my mom, like, what it would take for you to have another child, just out of curiosity, not that she's going to do that anytime soon, but she said it would take $1 billion for her to have another child. So that gives you kind of an idea that, this is not just about economics. Again, there's a lot of other factors at play here with these sorts of decisions.
Those insights on the baby bonus is kind of interesting. I remember when that was like getting put out, I think it was like $5,000 or something, and like we just had our second in October, and like with insurance, the cost of the delivery was much more than $5,000. So I think a lot of people were just kind of like scoffing of like, that's not enough money to incentivize somebody to have a baby and raise it through to adulthood. And just, yeah, to your point, like not a super effective carrot to move the needle. With population declining, there's still the emerging middle class, like a lot of economies like China, India. There's a lot of people that historically have been in poverty that are now in the middle class that are buying, imported food and more premium products. Does that help kind of offset the population decline issue?
I think the best criticism we've gotten of the big shrink is exactly that. The GDP per capita is a big factor here as well. And we certainly aren't denying that GDP per capita is important. And I think it's going to be more relevant to certain commodities relative to other commodities. Some commodities are probably going to benefit more from GDP per capita as opposed to population. But I will say that as GDP per capita increase, or as incomes increase, we tend to spend a lower proportion of our income on food. So often food demand doesn't increase in proportion to increases in income. That's something to consider. If I gave both of you $1,000, how much of that would you actually spend on only food? You might buy an iPad, you might go on a vacation, right? But if you gave that $1,000 to someone in a poor country, they're probably going to spend a higher proportion on food. And so as we see more of the population move into the middle class, I think we're going to see diminishing returns to the impact of income on food. And then in addition to that, we've been playing around with this idea of understanding what's the calorie demand look like over time, using our population estimates and forecasts, and also forecasting calorie demand into the future. What does calorie demand look like going forward? And it pushes that peak out a little bit, but still, I think calorie demand may be flattening out pretty soon.
Okay, so what can farmers do with this information, right? This is like, oh yeah, the economist is saying all this stuff, but what can we practically do? I think it'd be great to talk about farmers and maybe also just ag tech companies, right? Peripheral businesses, how they should be thinking about these trends in the economy?
Yeah, absolutely. As economists, it's a lot easier to diagnose problems than to offer solutions. I think economists often are invited to parties because of that. They're constantly talking about risk, but not necessarily opportunity. So I think, to put it in a phrase, I think it's all about shifting from quantity to quality, shifting to more quality trade partners. We're not saying that exports are going to all of a sudden poof and disappear. Exports are still going to be really, really important, but I think it's going to be really, really important to target those countries that have a positive demographic and income story to tell. I think of Brazil, I think of Indonesia as two countries that are upper middle income and also have very, very large populations. We export relatively little to those countries in terms of ag products. So there's that. I think innovation is another really, really important part of this as well. When we think about different industries in agriculture, some have been really, really good at innovation and continuing to increase demand per capita at home and also abroad. So I think innovation is going to continue to be an important piece. Part of that is going to be value add, looking for other products to use different commodities in. And then finally, I think it's going to be really important at the farmer level to think about diversifying revenue streams, whether that's diversifying which crops are grown and focusing more on value as opposed to volume, but then also thinking about what to do with marginal acres and possibly, converting marginal acres towards other cash flow streams, whether that's solar, whether that's agritourism, all these other kind of opportunities that are out there to help farmers maximize the total revenue that's coming off the farm. The way we've kind of put it is like, the conversion of marginal farmland to new revenue streams kind of moves the focus from farmland as an asset to grow commodities to farmland as a commodity off of which we grow revenue.
I think that's a really interesting way to think about it. Yeah, like how can you diversify your farming operation and get into these other verticals where you're not fully reliant on crop revenue, where you're kind of de-risking the operation with solar generation, that kind of stuff. Matt, there's a lot happening in the administration with tariffs, with new bills. Like anything that you're seeing that's kind of relevant for kind of West Coast specialty growers as it relates to tariffs or the most recent bill that was passed?
Yeah, it's really challenging to see. I mean, we've seen with the bill that was passed recently, it increased support for a lot of farming programs, which is important. Out here in the specialty crop world, I think that primarily means export promotion, right? Things work a little bit differently in specialty crops in that sense. As far as the tariffs go, that's a really tough one. We keep on seeing changes there. Things have probably changed since I've been speaking on this podcast even. And so it's pretty challenging to fully kind of absorb that effect right now. There has been interesting research looking at what the tariffs did last time around. I think it's important to keep in mind, though, how these tariffs look different compared to last time. Last time, I think it took the applied tariff rate to U.S. applying tariffs to other countries from about maybe 2% to 3%. With these new sets of tariff programs, it brings it up from about 3% to 26%, according to what was announced April 2nd. And then, what we're actually seeing, I think it's like 3% to 17%. And so, again, economists are more used to analyzing when things go to 2% to 3%. Very hard to know what will happen going from 3% to 17%.
Matt, there's been like a lot of conversation with respect to California about acres moving out of California. And that's driven by high regulatory burden on California farmers and also high labor costs. And that's why I think there's a lot of investment and talk around automation and robotics. Like, what's your thought there around this idea of, California agriculture slowly going away and being moved to other parts of the world?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of California agriculture truly being run out due to regulation. I do think regulation is a huge problem. We saw that Cal Poly study that showed that regulation was around a little over $100 per acre in 2006. And as of last year, it was $1,600 per acre. And I can tell you that, when I visit our farm credit customers, this is a topic that comes up very consistently in California. I think it's particularly relevant to California. I think at the same time, California also has a lot going for it in terms of soil quality, weather, There's very few places where you can grow a lot of the types of crops we've grown. I've been really impressed, and I'm interested to get your guys' thoughts on this, but I've been really impressed with what I'm seeing in terms of what ag tech can do. It kind of feels like we are on the cusp or at the beginning of a new era in ag tech. I mean, I can tell you that when I was farming tomatoes, a few years ago, I was approached by some ag tech companies and would talk to people in the field and was always kind of skeptical about what they could deliver. But what I'm seeing as I visit operations is pretty remarkable. And you have to imagine that only continues. And again, as regulations continue to be a huge hindrance, I think that just becomes more and more attractive. I think anyone who really wants to dive into this should refer to the Western growers case studies that looked at what some of these laser weeders could do, what some of these smart cultivators can do. I mean, I think we're truly on the cusp of seeing this stuff in action for the first time in a big, big way.
Yeah, Ty and I have spoken about this. It feels like we're in kind of ag tech 2.0, where the first wave of companies that were kind of riding the wave of a few of them are still around, but it's like kind of a new cohort of companies that are out there, and the speed to kind of get stuff commercialized. I think there's an emphasis on profitability and getting things to market quicker. So like just on our farm this year, I think we've tested out 4 different kind of smart cultivator tools. And typically, like, 3 years ago when I tried to talk to these companies, it was like, oh, we only do leafy greens, we're focused on salinas, it's going to take us years to build a model. Was with a company yesterday that built a model on a fly in the morning, and we were running commercially in the afternoon with a smart cultivator. So it's getting a lot quicker to get like growers real tangible results in a couple of days versus years out. So that's been cool to see.
Yeah, and that's been my impression as well. It seems like Salinas is a little bit further ahead on a lot of this stuff, possibly just given the operations that are in Salinas, and also those crops might be easier from an innovation standpoint. But even in the Central Valley, I mean, there's some really impressive stuff out there that's made me really optimistic about ag tech.
Okay, another take I want to get of yours is that seems like there's a lot of conflicting information out there in ag media or just media generally around farmer sentiment. You'll see an article one day that farmer sentiment's all-time high, and another day that it's at an all-time low. Can you help us make sense of this? Like, what's your perception of this?
I mean, my perception is that farmer sentiment is indeed low. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, keep in mind that consumer sentiment is been at record lows as well. It's kind of this conflicting thing because, at least as far as consumer sentiment goes, the economy has actually been doing pretty well. We got some pretty impressive GDP growth numbers today, right? And so the economy continues to operate at a pretty good pace, but consumers are not feeling great. And I think part of the reason is one or two things in the economy that consumers really, really feel. It's inflation and interest rates. These are things that consumers really experience in a major way in their day-to-day lives. And so I think that kind of explains the discrepancy there. And then, as far as farmer sentiment goes, I think a lot of farmers are seeing low commodity prices combined with really high inflation, which has hurt their input costs. What we tend to see with commodities is those prices tend to adjust more quickly than a lot of the input prices. You think about a lot of the input prices, they tend to be a lot stickier. These are often services. Services prices tend to be a lot stickier. And so to me, it's no surprise that we're seeing farmer sentiment at relatively low levels.
Yeah, if you ask me that question, I would say lows, like just in our general area, like we're seeing, tomato pricing come down and contract pricing go down across the board. We're in a big wine grape region, and the wine grape deal is obviously super depressed right now, and vineyards getting ripped out. So yeah, pretty interesting, these polls. It's almost like political polls that, like, I don't know who's responding to these polls or like what farmers are excited, but there's a huge spectrum of farms of like, we're kind of biased because we're West Coast specialty crop, but maybe things are better in different pockets of the country, and kind of more commodity row crop type stuff where there are more like frothy subsidies going out to folks.
Yeah, it's always a challenge to like truly knowing what sentiment indices are capturing. In an ideal world, consumer sentiment is capturing consumers' feelings about the economy, but there's a lot baked into that, and it's a lot harder to fully unpack than it might seem on the surface. There's probably sentiment about the political environment baked in there to a certain degree, sentiment about a whole variety of things that it's probably capturing. So it's always important to keep that in mind.
All right, Matt, we can't have a podcast in 2025 and not bring up AI. I would love to get your thoughts just on, from a economist's perspective, of I think there's like varying opinions around the impact of AI, and specifically around what it means for the economy and growth. I think a lot of people that are optimistic would suggest that we are going to have a big boom in the economy, both from the construction of AI data centers to then the productivity boost on top of that. And so we're entering this era potentially of prosperity and productivity that's going to lead to continued GDP growth. Like, do you agree with that analysis, one? And then based on that, like, what's the impact to agriculture down to ag?
I think it's kind of a wait and see. I mean, we thought we were going to have massive productivity gains with the internet. And, I don't want to speak for all economists, but I think most economists would agree that the internet did not cause the kind of productivity gains that many were expecting. There's the quote by Robert Solow, the famous economist, who said, you can see the computer revolution in everywhere except the productivity statistics. It's kind of a strange thing. And so I think it's very hard for technologies to actually figure their way into the economy. It takes a long time for people to figure that out. If you go back through history and look at major technologies, even like electricity, it took a long time for that to actually make its way into users' hands and into business owners' hands to be put to use. And so I think it's a little bit difficult to say. I would warn against any headlines that say AI is the reason for, high unemployment levels among college graduates, for instance. I'd be really, really wary of trying to make that connection at this point. As far as agriculture goes, I think it directly relates to what we were talking about on the ag tech side. I think there's probably an amazing amount of things that AI can do with, computer vision and analyzing images in a way that's never been done before. Again, you guys know a lot about this, but the next frontier is probably going to be on the robotics side. We've seen incredible developments in AI. I think that next frontier is going to be more on robotics.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap it. Matt, this has been a ton of fun having you back on. As we wrap up here, how can listeners get in touch with you and Terrain?
Yeah, so you can go to terrainag.com. Definitely check us out. We're constantly releasing reports, and feel free to reach out over email. My email's on there. We're always happy to talk.
So, Tim, what do you think of that conversation with our favorite ag economist, Matt?
I always enjoy talking to Matt. When you hear the word ag economist, you usually this is super formidable, but Matt's super friendly, easy to talk to. I think he does a great job of kind of breaking down these complex issues. I think it was really interesting getting into changes in demographic data and what that means at a macro level, and kind of zooming out with some of these conversations that we're having about just kind of market by market, crop by crop markets, and kind of what the macro trends are facing the ag industry. So I think that was super interesting to break down.
If you guys want more insights like that, you got to check out Terrain. Terrain and American Ag Credit are sponsoring this podcast. And so you can get a ton of this type of insights across a ton of different crops, not just California specialty, but across every crop type. Terrain has coverage and analysis for those for anyone interested in checking that out. So check the link in our show notes to learn more about Terrain and American Ag Credit. We appreciate them sponsoring the show. With that, we appreciate you listening, and we will be back next week with another great episode.